Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike.shop. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Might help if I push the right button there. Tonight I'm going to be talking about one of my books, Paranormal Laredo. But first, if you are a fan of the show and you'd like to show off just a little bit, check out my merchandise at tpublic.com. You can get t-shirts, coffee cups, bags, notebooks, and a lot more. What with Christmas coming up soon, it's time to get started with your shopping. Go to tpublic.com and search for Strange Things with Chris James. Last week we drove down to Edinburgh to attend the Los Muertos Festival. Lots to see and hear. There were a bunch of Katrinas running around who must have spent a year's wages on their outfits. Once the sun went down, it cooled off and folks were able to move around without sweating too much. The festival covered several blocks, including the Edinburgh City Hall. I sold a bunch of books. We wrapped things up at about 11, and it was a long drive home. I used to drive all night long without any trouble. Get home as the sun was coming up and sleep for 2 or 3 hours, and I was ready to do things. Well, not anymore. I slept until the dogs came and woke me up to feed them, and I was tired all day. We did as little as possible, and, well, the next day I wasn't much better. It's amazing what happens as you constantly abuse yourself. Things just don't bounce back the way they used to. I asked my wife what she thought would make a good show for the end of the month, and Halloween being just a couple of days. She said I should talk about my book, Paranormal Laredo. I did a show a while ago on it, so I'll try to cover some stories I didn't get to the last time. Why is it, you suppose, that some spirits will linger on after death, but not all of them? What is happening in life and death that causes people's spirits to either move on to the next plane of existence or stay around, haunting a location? Some say it has to do with unfinished business. Others will say the spirits are afraid of what might be waiting on the other side. The Hindu believe in cremating the body so the spirit will sever all ties to this life and move on to the next. Only very young children and the spiritually enlightened are buried. These folks don't have anything holding them to their former life. Well, how about the locations haunted by spirits? People have visited old falling down buildings that have zero activity. The land where trench warfare of World War I took place has very few hauntings. Researchers are surprised by the lack of ghost activity in a place with so much death. Many of those killed were never found. Their bodies are still there, mixed in with the dirt. Then again, there are reports of hauntings in brand new houses and buildings that had no history of anyone ever dying in or near them. One explanation is the construction of houses and buildings on top of cemeteries where the grave markers were removed but not the bodies. This has happened way too many times. This does not explain all the hauntings. There are ghosts and spirits seen in brand new buildings with no history of anyone ever dying in or around the place, and no one ever being buried. Paranormal investigators call these walk-ins or transient spirits. There must be many kinds of ghosts. Some are trapped in one location, while others roam about free to travel where they want. Could this be a result of the person's personality while they were alive? Some ghosts are seen in the same outfit every time, while others change their clothes. Some ghost sightings are what's known as a residual haunting. This is kind of like a tape recording that plays over and over. The spirit doesn't interact with any of the witnesses. These are the ghost stories where the phantom moves about as if those seeing it don't exist. Then there are spirits that will interact with witnesses. They look at the people and sometimes sounds will be heard or recorded. The spirit of the dead is aware of its condition and those around it. On occasion, the spirit looked as shocked when seeing the witness as the witnesses themselves. Many people witness ghosts and are scared by them, while others see the ghosts as being what happens when somebody passes on. Maybe the ghost is as afraid of the witness as the witness is of the ghost. Why is it some people can see ghosts while others never see anything paranormal? These people can spend the night in a well-known haunted location only to come away without having an encounter. I have talked with people who see ghosts all the time and consider them to be just a part of day-to-day life. Others are terrified after having one sighting. There are people out there who had a ghost or a UFO sighting only to convince themselves after the fact that they didn't actually see anything. They are so bent on their skeptical outlook, they deny what is right there in front of their eyes. I asked people to tell me their stories. Some had a lot to say, filling in details as they went, while others only gave me very brief tales. They saw something they couldn't explain. Some stories were passed on from generations past. I tried to put down all the details as I was given them. Many people didn't want their names mentioned, thinking those around them would consider them odd for having an experience or a sighting. Others I talked to insisted I used their names. I talked to a few people who had stories to tell, only to decide they didn't want their account put down on paper. I would reassure them I would not use their name if they didn't want me to, but they never got back to me with their statements. Paranormal is a general term invented sometime from 1915 or 1920, used to define experiences that cannot readily be explained by the range of normal experience or scientific explanation. To me, paranormal includes many things other investigators consider outside paranormal parameters. Some Bigfoot investigators don't like to think that a huge hair-covered creature living in the woods is paranormal. To them, this is an unknown ape waiting to be studied. I have talked with Bigfoot hunters who think ghost investigators are all crazy. I've met with UFO investigators who say Bigfoot is all just a big hoax. Some ghost hunters don't think flying saucers are real. The definition of paranormal for me is anything not found in mainstream science. Bigfoot, UFOs, ghosts are all paranormal in my book. From the very beginning, Villa de San Agustin de Laredo was the city on both sides of the Rio Grande. Even after the border between the United States and Mexico cut right through town, the citizens considered themselves to be one big happy family. Laredo and Nuevo Laredo. Many of the people I talked to had experiences on one side of the river or the other, and on occasion, both. Here are some of the stories I found while visiting people and locations all over town. I would ask if anyone in the group had ever seen a ghost. The response was never what I expected. Most would say they'd never seen anything unexplainable. Others would quickly go into interesting and informative details on things seen but unknown. As far as I know, all of these accounts are true. I have no reason to not believe the witnesses who were willing to share. They were willing to tell what they had seen, and I was willing to put it down in print. Few of us can say we died and then came back to life. Nora is one of the few I've met who can say she has been there and come back. When Nora was just 13, her mother found her laying on the floor in the bathroom. Her skin was gray. There were no signs of life. Her mom panicked, as we all would. Grabbing her child, the mother lifted the lifeless body and carried it into the bedroom, laid her on the bed. As she began to move, her color returned, and she was looking as if nothing had happened. Nora said the last thing she remembered was hearing somebody laughing in a malicious way, and she slipped from consciousness. This was just one of many odd occurrences in Nora's life. At about 15, Nora told her mother she was going out to the corner store and she'd be back in about 20 minutes. She walked to the corner store to buy some snacks. Once she had her stash of goodies, Nora returned home. Her mother asked why Nora had stood by the door, not answering her. Nora was confused and answered she had just come from the store. Her mother insisted Nora had been there 10 minutes ago, but stood by the door not saying anything. The image then stepped out the door just minutes before Nora arrived back home. What her mother saw sounds like what's called a Doppelganger. This is German for double goer, a ghost of a living person. Many say these are actually demons taking on the image of living people for nefarious purposes. No one knows for sure what might happen if we ever meet our own doppelganger. Some say bad things. It took Nora a lot of explaining to get her mother to believe it hadn't been her. Nora went on to take nursing classes at Laredo Community College from 1991 to 94. Then she finally finished in 2000. Many of her fellow students told about seeing robed figures moving about after dark in the area where the old tennis courts used to be. There's a parking lot there now. Nora found a newspaper ad looking for medically trained personnel and went to apply for the job. She was hired to work at one of the many technical schools in and around Laredo. Her position was medical assistant instructor. She was working late one evening when she heard footsteps in the room above her. The building was empty, but it sounded as if someone or something, was walking around over her head. The footsteps moved over to the staircase and began to descend. Nora was torn between running for the door or standing her ground. The footsteps reached the last step and then began to move towards her door. Nora heard the invisible entity step over the threshold and move right in front of her. There was no one there as far as she could see. As she said, she could feel something was there, but could see nothing. The entity felt angry because Nora wasn't cowering in front of it. As she had to reach deep down inside herself and say, "Go away, leave me alone." Whatever had come down the stairs suddenly vanished. About a month later, Nora was finishing work. Walking out to her car to leave for home, as she was about to get behind the wheel, she could feel a burning sensation on the back of her leg. It felt like something had scratched her skin under her medical scrubs. When she got home, Nora went to the bathroom to see what was wrong with her leg. There was a 12 to 14-inch scratch running down the back of her leg. Wondering where the scratch might have come from, she checked her car, as well as trying to think of anything at work that might have injured her. It would have been able to scratch her through the leg of her uniform. Since it ran up and down, it was impossible to credit the wound to any activity she had performed. Shortly after this happened, the folks at the front office of the school decided Nora was no longer needed and she was let go. Nora thinks there was something malicious going on at this particular school, as if she might have been set up to have an encounter with this unseen thing from upstairs. When she refused to panic or respond in a properly alarmed manner, her employment was canceled. I was able to track down some of the folks that used to work in the same building. They all said, late at night, they would hear someone or something moving around upstairs. No one was in a hurry to go upstairs in the dark and find out who it might have been. They would all do their best to ignore the sounds and try to continue with their work. A police officer was called to one of the abandoned buildings south of Washington Street. It was a warm, as in hot, night in Laredo. It was about 90 degrees. The officer checked out at the location where a report had come in of people hanging out on the second floor. People don't hang out in abandoned buildings late at night for lawful reasons. The officer entered the building and made his way to the stairs. He went along quietly and carefully. He listened, trying to catch any voices to determine if there were just a few or many folks involved. The second floor was quiet. He steps out on the second floor and he began checking rooms. There was nobody in any as he made his way along the corridor. One door was closed, so he gently pushed it open with his foot. The room was empty as well, but the air was cold. It felt like someone had a very strong air conditioner running at full blast. Only the building had no electricity. The power had been off for years. The officer quickly checked the rest of the building and got out to his unit as fast as possible. Why that one room was so cold on a hot night was never explained. During ghost hunts, the equipment has a tendency to fail more often than not. The theory is spirits will draw energy from electronic devices in order to feed themselves. One place that is bursting with energy is a school. Kids have too much energy, and most schools today try to keep kids under control, and all that energy is simmering inside overly active bodies. Kind of like having a building filled with batteries ready to be unleashed. This may explain why many schools are home to spirits and ghosts. At 4:30 in the afternoon, the employees at the school were all signing out for the day. They would file past the front desk and say their goodbyes before heading home. As several of them were at the desk at the same time, the door to the assistant principal's office began to make a sound. It sounded as if someone was trying to open the door. The assistant principal was gone for the day, and the door was locked. The handle was jiggling up and down, and the door was rattling in the frame. For safety reasons, the doors were designed that even when locked, they could be opened from the inside. This way, nobody would be locked in. Several of the employees all stood there looking at the door as it rattled, wondering what was going on. Getting the pass key, one of them unlocked the door to maybe help the person on the other side. As the door swung open, they could all see there was nobody in the room. It didn't take very long to look in every corner of the office. This was a new building and had no history of such things, but there it was, right in broad daylight. Later, it was learned that several times the custodial staff had heard children in the hallway after everyone had gone home. There was no explanation as to what or who they were hearing. Schools have had some unexplainable activity for as long as folks have been keeping track of things like this. Here in Laredo, we have 2 school districts. We also have a lot of private schools. We believe ghosts need to get energy from somewhere outside of themselves. They don't eat food, as far as we know, so they have to get their energy from somewhere else. During ghost investigations, batteries have a tendency to go dead as soon as we need them. We think the spirits are drawing off the energy for themselves. If people with us are afraid, we always get them to go first. The idea being the ghosts will be attracted to all that energy coming off of them in the form of fear. Kids have a way too much energy. They radiate energy all around themselves, and maybe the spirits can use this energy to do all the things ghosts and spirits are known to do. People have seen and heard things in schools once all the kids are gone. Doors open and close, footsteps running around with no body to make them. With the advancement of technology, the schools began using cameras to keep an eye on things. Should somebody misbehave, there was a record of what actually had happened. After hours, the cameras are used to make sure nobody breaks in and tries to steal or damage anything. On many occasions, the security people monitoring these cameras have seen a child walking along the hallway in one of the schools. On a few occasions, this has happened while the custodians are cleaning. The security guard would contact the custodians using a 2-way radio and ask them to check on the intruder. On one occasion, the guard called saying he could see a little girl in the hall. The custodians arrived and they didn't see anyone. The security guard informed them the child was standing right next to them. The image was visible on the monitor. But the people right there, nothing. This did nothing to make the cleaning staff feel like working late into the night. They quickly made it to a different part of the building, finished their duties, and left. David is a member of the Laredo Paranormal Research Society. Here is what David told me in his own words. When I was 7 or 8 years old, we lived at 2203 Camp Street in Laredo, Texas. My mom, Gilda, used to have a doll that looked like a real baby. She used to take care of it like it was real. As she would clean it with a cloth and comb its hair. I didn't like this doll because it looked creepy, and every time I would get near it, I used to get this eerie feeling like it was staring at me. On a few nights when I couldn't sleep, I would see the doll walking around the backyard. I told my sister, Lorena, and she said she had seen the doll walking along the kitchen counters from time to time. She was 10 or 11 years old at the time. After being terrorized by the doll for a few months, my mom locked the doll in the closet. She secured the door with a chain and a lock. We didn't understand at the time, but many years later my mom told my sister she had seen the doll walking around the house, and this had scared her to near death. To keep the doll from moving about the house, she locked the doll in the closet. We thought it was weird because she used to take care of that doll like it was her own child. The mall is just 3 blocks from my house. Instead of driving there on the few occasions we go, we just simply walk. It saves on finding a parking spot. From the first few days in Laredo, I've heard stories about strange things being seen or heard at the mall. When I set out to write this book, I went by the main office of the mall to ask if just maybe they could fill in some of the stories I'd heard. The woman at the desk called security, but in a good way. I wound up sitting at the head of security's desk while he called in officers and staff to tell me what they had seen and heard. Kire worked at Mall del Norte for a few years. He has had a few odd encounters in his time there. The first place he worked was at Macy's store as a support person. His job was to fetch anything needed to stock the shelves and move anything too heavy for the sales clerks. The store has 3 floors, but only 2 are open to the public. The middle or second floor is used for storage. The ceiling is kind of low, and it gives it a very claustrophobic feel. In November, as it was raining outside, Akire was sent to the storage floor to pick up some boxes of perfume. The room was called the Fragrance Room, which at one time had been a bathroom. The wall was still covered with mirrors, but in place of the stalls there were shelves from floor to ceiling. He pulled his cart to the door and then went to find the boxes he needed. As he was bending down to check the labels, a box fell from one of the shelves. It hit the floor with a bang, but none of the bottles broke. Akire picked up the box and put it back on the shelf. He moved to another shelf only to hear the same box hit the floor once more. As he stood there looking at the box, wondering what might be going on, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Thinking this was the manager, who had a tendency to do this, Akire turned and asked what was up. There was nobody there. He quickly moved to the door to see if someone had slipped out, and he saw a leg disappearing around the door jamb. Akire moved to the hallway just in time to see the same leg vanish around the corner at the end of the hall. The hall was a dead end. There's nowhere to go, no place they could have hidden. Shaking off this weird encounter, he made his way back down to the main floor. There, he ran into a woman who asked what was going on. Kirei told her what had just happened, and she said, "That's why your position is always vacant." Kirei moved from a support position to security officer. Late one night, one of the employees at one of the stores came back inside saying she had forgotten her cell phone in the store. He went in with her to help look. Inside the store, they both saw a man wearing a blue striped polo shirt moving around the displays. Kirei went into security mode and went to see who this was and what he was doing in a store after hours. He searched the entire store. He looked in any place a person could hide. There was nothing. Had the sales clerk not seen the man too, this might have been just imagination. Two people don't imagine the same thing at the same time. James worked the 6 p. to 2 a. shift each night. Kirei worked the 12 midnight till the 8 a.m. shift. During the 2-hour overlap, they would work together. A call came in from the police department saying there was a motion alarm set off in the Luby's cafeteria. While James went to have a look through the windows, Kirei went to the office to check the security cameras. James got to the front door of the cafeteria and looked in just as someone ran around the corner from the first corridor into the serving line to the right. James called Kirei and asked if he could see the suspect at the far end of the public area. The man he'd seen was wearing a blue striped polo shirt. Kirei checked the closed-circuit camera but didn't see anyone in the restaurant. There was silverware scattered about the floor as if some disgruntled employee had had a fit. The cash register cover was on the floor as well. James called the police and told them he had seen somebody inside but lost sight of the intruder. He also called the manager of the cafeteria. This was standard policy. James checked the entrance and exit to be sure they were both locked. They were. He stepped outside through entrance number 3 to look in through the outside windows near the entrance to the mall. The police showed up in force. 6 officers came to search for the man inside the restaurant. The manager came along as well to be sure everything was okay. No one was found inside the cafeteria, and there was no sign of anyone having broken in. The silverware on the floor could not be explained. It wasn't there when the manager had locked up just a few hours ago. A ghost of a little girl has been seen all over Laredo. From the library on McPherson to the Laredo College at Old Fort McIntosh. The sports arena on Loop 20 and Mall del Norte have had a few reports of a ghost girl as well. In 1981, Laura lived close to the Laredo College on Santa Rita Street. At the time, it was called Laredo Junior College. Her and her family lived in a small wood-framed house near the tracks that came from Mexico and ran north to San Antonio. Trains go by when they're hooking up, and this is a rule that they blow their horns as they approach any and all intersections. This is not a quiet place to try to get any sleep, since trains would hook up and head north at all hours of the day and night. Laura shared a room with her older sister. They were both asleep late one night when they heard the sound of someone tapping on the window. Being young kids, 6 and 9, They both looked out and saw a young girl and boy standing right by the glass. The girl was in a white nightgown with a brown coat over it. She had reddish-brown hair. The boy was in knee pants with a barn jacket. The young girl looked to be about 6 or 8 years old, and the boy was younger. As they stood there right outside the window, they were holding hands with each other. The girl asked them to come outside to play. Laura and her sister were tempted, but their father had told them they had to stay in the house after dark, and so they said they couldn't come outside. The girl in white kept asking and motioning for the two to join them outside the house. After a bit, the two outside went away, only to return a few nights later, knock at the window, and invite Laura and her sister to come out and play. After each late-night visit, Laura noticed her cat would be missing. She had to search for him and found him cowering under the bed. It took a lot of persuasion to get him to come out. Any time the little girl and her brother came, the cat would go hide again. After this had gone on for a few weeks, Laura mentioned the late-night visitor to her dad. He thought Laura was just imagining things. He said there's no way anyone could have knocked on the window because it's 5 feet off the ground. The glass would have been out of reach of a small kid. Soon after the family moved away to the north side of town, the girl in white and her brother no longer came to visit. The house, along with all of its neighbors, was torn down and a warehouse was built on the block. Friday, August 2018. Alex had just gotten hired to work at the public library on McPherson. He was watching as everybody left for the day, and he noticed a woman with 3 kids walk into the ladies' room. One of the girls was very well dressed, as if she were on her way to church. Well, young girls do like to dress up sometimes. Shortly, the woman came walking out the door, followed by 2 children. Alex watched the door, waiting for the 3rd girl to come out and join her family. The woman left the building as if not knowing or caring she was short one of her kids. Alex asked one of the maintenance personnel and the security guard to go see what had happened to the little girl. They went into the bathroom and then came back out. There's no one in there. Alex knew he'd seen the woman and 3 kids go in and only 2 kids come out. They all just kind of laughed about it, saying it must have been a ghost. This is not something covered in the employee training. A little girl has been seen in a school during daytime. Staff members have seen her walking by the windows of their offices. She is seen wearing a white dress, far too fancy for school time. It looks more like she's going to church or a fancy party. Anytime they go to see why this one student is wandering around while they should all be in class, the girl can't be found. There's a security guard at the end of the hallway, and there's no place to hide, so the girl simply vanishes once she's traversed the office area. In a hotel in Laredo, a man woke in the middle of the night to see a young girl in a white dress standing at the foot of his bed. It took him a second or two to focus on the girl and then wonder what was she doing in his room. Just as he was about to say something, the girl vanished. He looked around the room thinking this was a strange thing to have happen. The next day, He just mentioned the visit to the desk clerk, saying he thought a young girl was in his room last night. The clerk was surprised by the story, knowing about the sightings being mentioned at the mall, which was just across the street. At Fort McIntosh, people have seen a little girl hanging around at several locations. The image they report is a girl about 7 or 8 years old. She's dressed in old-style clothing. Her shoes have buttons along the side. This would put her as having lived around 1870 to 1914. People see a young girl walking along the sidewalk or crossing the street on the fort. When they lose sight of her, they simply write it off, thinking she must have turned a corner or entered one of the buildings. Her address is just mistaken in viewing, they think. Most of these sightings are never mentioned. A police officer was checking out a report of suspicious activity at the motor pool late one night. This area was west from the old guardhouse, behind the bookstore. The officer spotted someone walking around in the yard where the vehicles were stored. He could see it was a young girl who shouldn't have been wandering around so late at night. The officer asked her what she was doing wandering around in an area off limits to unauthorized personnel. The girl just kept walking along as if she hadn't heard him. He was about to follow when the little girl faded from view. 1 second she was there, looking as real as anyone. The next she was gone. The same little girl has been seen walking along the walkway in front of the chapel. Late at night, people have seen a little girl dressed in old-style clothing walking along as if heading someplace. Whenever anyone tries to approach her, she vanishes. And she's also been seen in front of the old hospital. One night, a police officer was driving slowly along the streets of the college. As he was driving, he spotted what looked like a little girl standing on top of one of the trash cans, using the lid like a pedestal. He drove up next to her, and she jumped from the trash can onto the hood of his patrol unit. The officer slammed on the brakes and jumped out of his unit. The girl was nowhere to be seen. She had vanished without a trace. He described her as being about 7 to 8 years old, dressed in an old-style clothing, like from the turn of the century. The Laredo Paranormal Research Society conducted a month of ghost investigations and tours at the Laredo College. On the second night of investigations, Ishmael and Dr. Ricardo Solis, the college president, were walking around the old stable area, which is now the motor pool. Ishmael had a thermal camera showing Dr. Solis how the device worked. Suddenly, a figure appeared on the screen. It was about as big as a 6-year-old. Ishmael tried to record the image, but the camera's memory was either full or it just wasn't working. They both agreed it had looked like the little girl. We live close to the mall, as in a few blocks. It's easier to walk there than drive due to parking. Over the years, I've heard stories about the ghosts seen by the cleaning staff. The folks that clean up Mall del Norte late at night have reported seeing a little girl hanging around near the Sears store at the south end of the building. She's been seen walking around the concourse in front of the store and sometimes sitting on the benches in the area. The girl looks to be about 7 years old. She's usually wearing a fancy-looking dress that looks more like something to go to church rather than shopping. It looks like a dress straight out of the 1900s. Sometimes she's been seen holding a doll clutched to her chest. Other times, she isn't holding anything. The reports are usually about 10 o'clock at night when all the shoppers have gone home. People also report hearing her crying as if she's lost and looking for her mother. Anytime any people go to see what is wrong with her, she just disappears. On occasion, they'll hear her but not see her. The Laredo Paranormal Research Society had arranged to spend the late evening looking into the story, but things didn't work out due to scheduling and liability. I have stopped on occasion and tried looking through some of the doors right around 10:30 at night, but you have to be in the right spot at the right time. Even then, it's not a sure thing. Some ghosts are like clockwork. They show up and do the same thing over and over. These are known as residual hauntings, kind of like a tape recording running the same scene over and over. Then there are what's known as intelligent hauntings. This is more like a ghost is aware of where it is and who is around. This is when you'll feel your hair being pulled or you'll receive an answer to your questions. The ghost is trying to interact with the witness. The description of the little girl is very close to the one seen out at Fort McIntosh. The ghost at Fort McIntosh hasn't been seen holding a doll, but the rest sounds the same. Could this be the same ghost or spirit? It's 3 miles in a straight line from Mall del Norte to Fort McIntosh. Could or would a ghost travel that far? We don't know. Until a ghost sits down and allows an interview, we may never know. Ghosts don't follow the same rules as we do. At the mall, there's a meter box located outside. The door has been seen to open by itself. Inside the box, somebody wrote with a felt-tipped pen, "Have you seen her?" Anyone reading this message thinks of the ghost of the little girl right away. On Highway 83 South, long before the Laredo College South Campus was built, there was a huge brick and cement house built on a hill. Some folks referred to this as a casino, thinking it was built as a gaming establishment. It did look somewhat auspicious from the highway. Working for the Border Patrol, we had access to the property. It was used for cattle mostly, and sometimes smuggling. On a few occasions, we went into the house looking for anyone who just might have crossed the river. There were no doors, so anybody could have gotten in anytime they wished. The inside was far more impressive than the outside. The kitchen was huge, maybe 25 by 30 feet. There were brick archways built over the countertops. All the rooms on the ground floor were bigger than anything found in a normal home. None of them looked like bedrooms. The place had a basement as well. This was a spooky place to go because the stairs going down were steep and winding, leading to a hallway that was very narrow. At the bottom of the stairs was a narrow hallway that ran east and west. All along this corridor were small rooms with no known purpose. In the east end of the basement was a small room with glass blocks set into the ceiling. This would allow anyone standing there to look up and see who was standing at the front door. It would be from the feet up, but still an odd thing to have. Because the house sat on a hill, the west end of the basement hallway led out into the yard. The stairs going up to what should be the second floor ended in a large landing. The stairs were wide and made from poured cement. At the top of the landing was a door that led into a crawl space under the roof. Not really an attic, since the roof was only 4 feet high. Having worked in construction before joining the patrol, I think the roof was temporary cover until construction could continue. The second floor had yet to be built. With no bedrooms on the first floor, the second floor must have been planned for some time later. The house had been built by a family that owned dairy cattle. Instead of being a casino, it was a dairy. For some odd reason, the house was never finished. It was kind of creepy in the daytime, and at night it was downright scary. A Border Patrol agent was checking the building to see if anyone was trying to sneak into the country. He walked around the building to what looked like a loading dock that stuck out from the west end. Under this structure, someone had carved a pentagram into the ground. It was about the size you would expect to see used during some kind of a ceremony. This would have made an ideal location for some covert activity. It was in a location nobody could see from either the road or the streets nearby. The land was acquired by Laredo College and the South Campus was built. Right near where the house used to stand is a 2-story modern building. People have reported seeing a shadow being on the second floor. It stands in the alcove leading into the bathrooms. Those who see it say it looks about as big as a 6 or 8-year-old girl, peeking around the corner. She ducks back into the dark before the witness can get a good look at her, and then she vanishes. People have tried to find this shadowy girl. The Laredo Paranormal Research Society spent many nights standing and sitting by the bathroom doors. They used all their fancy gadgets and a psychic or two. The shadow refused to cooperate. There isn't a lot for young kids to do here in Laredo. No amusement parks or attractions. Sometimes kids find things to do on their own. Out to the east of town at the end of Delmar Boulevard is San Ignacio Road. At one time, San Ignacio Road ran out to a group of live fire ranges used by the Army during World War II. You can still find piles of used bullets all over the impact area. After the war, the land was turned into a radar base. The radar base was closed and moved out to Oilton. The land was turned over to the county and turned into a detention center. The folks there were mostly serving light sentences, mostly for less than a year. Webb County signed a contract with the Texas Department of Corrections to house some folks who had more time to serve. Some of these guys were a bit more violent. Late one night, the wrong thing was said to the wrong person. A small riot broke out, which turned into a big riot. The inmates burned parts of the detention center down. The sheriff called in all of his deputies. This was followed by a request for the Border Patrol's Special Response Team. A Laredo Police Department was asked to help along with the Department of Public Safety. A Texas Department of Corrections showed up to manage their prisoners. The area around the detention center was a mix of green, brown, blue, and gray uniforms. It took 2 days to get things under control, and TDC brought buses in and hauled away their prisoners. The county took their prisoners to the downtown jail. The detention center was too badly damaged to be repaired, and so the county just abandoned it. Kids began telling stories about the abandoned facility having been in an insane asylum, and there were murderers locked up out there. Others said the place was filled with black magic practitioners. This led to groups of curious people sneaking out to have a look. Carl and a few friends drove out to the gate that led to the facility. There was a locked gate about a half a mile from the detention center that had to be jumped. The road in was in bad shape back during the riots, and it hadn't been worked on since. Trees hung over the pavement, and the fence was falling down in places. The road in ran past the facility and wound around to the north end, where it ended in a huge gate. The gated area was covered by a roof, so as officers or agents were coming in, had some place to keep the sun off during the day. Any and all sidearms had to be placed in locked boxes at the gate area. The next gate was only opened once the first gate was closed and locked. Once the complex was shut down, the gates were all left open. Inside the fence, the facility consists of 9 cement block buildings for prisoner housing, administration, and recreation. The kids broke up into couples and began roaming about the building looking for anything of interest. When Webb County closed the facility, they left behind most of the equipment and supplies. There were bunks, tables, chairs, and all the cell blocks. The beds had moldy sheets and pillows which had managed to endure years of neglect. Books and papers were strewn about the ground, along with prisoner uniforms and shoes. Carl was with a goth girl who seemed very interested in this empty jail. As they were walking around near the main entrance, something big jumped off the roof over the gates. This startled them, but it wasn't enough to scare them off. They wandered about, finding themselves in the chow hall. The tables and benches were still there, along with trays and plastic spoons. As Carl was looking about the desolation, a plastic tray came flying from one side of the room, hitting him in the face. He was nearly knocked from his feet. There was nobody in the building other than him and his female companion. Carl decided it was time to find the others and get out of there. They moved quickly through the open areas and managed to find the rest of the group, all in one of the supply buildings. In the center of the floor, clothes and bedding had piled it up. As Carl was telling his friends about the flying tray, something moved under the clothes. Old uniforms and sheets began falling away from some unknown being rising up from the middle of the pile. The whole gang turned and ran for the gate. As Carl was running, he glanced back to see if anything was chasing them. He saw what looked like a witch, all in black, coming along behind them. He yelled to get the others to run faster, and they all bolted through the gates, jumped into the truck. They sped away, looking back to see if the thing was still following. There was nothing on the road. Today, there's a gate at the beginning of San Ignacio Road, so it's a 3.5-mile walk to the detention center gate, and then another half-mile walk from there to the detention center. And the place is in a lot worse shape today than it was back then. If you enjoyed the stories and you want to read more, you can find Paranormal Laredo at the Phoenix Bookstore or the Organic Man Coffee Trike here in Laredo, or you can visit Amazon.com and you'll find it there. Now, Paranormal Laredo is mostly just stories from Laredo. My next book is made up of stories from all over the place. So, if you have a story A ghost story, a UFO story, something you saw or something a friend or relative told you about, send me the story and I'll put it in the next book. If you want to contact me, you can get me at strangethings@arcanasa.com. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you, are you, are you,
What the heck is
are
that?
you, are
Okay,
you?
well, so much for that. I don't know what's going on with my recording here, but I'll try and get it figured out.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here, no stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.